Hi everyone, today I have a gouache landscape tutorial. This is a shorter version of the full 1.5 hour long real-time tutorial that I have on Patreon. If you prefer tutorials where none of the video is sped up and you can paint along with me at the same pace, then check out my Patreon where I post real-time gouache tutorials every month. I already have over 50 tutorials on there. I'll have a link down below so you can have a look at that. So let's jump straight into talking about the colors that I used for today's tutorial. So for the blues, I've got a cool blue and a warm blue. The cool blue here, it's called Sky Blue. This one is My Merry Gouache, but you can use any brand. For cool blues, you can pick something like a primary blue or a cerulean blue. And this will be used in the color of the sky and in the reflection in the water. The warm blue I will use to mix up some greens for the trees and a bit in the mountains. I've got black and burnt umber, which I'll use for some of the water here and just to tone down the blues. And then I've got a warm yellow and a cool yellow. The warm yellow I'll use for some of these warmer colors in the trees, and I'll use both of them just to mix up greens. And then I've just got white and this cool red. This one is called Deep Pink in De La Rowney's Designer Gouache, and I'll just use that red in that little bit over here. For brushes, I'll be using these three. They are from my set of brushes that I've designed with craft ammo that will be released hopefully later this year. So the brushes will look like these two here. This one looks different because this was the first design that I sent in, but I later changed it to this one with the rose gold ferrule and the darker handle and darker hair color. But I'm using this brush because I changed the softness of the hairs but decided that I wanted to go back to this. So these are from my brush set, but you can use any brush that suits you, preferably a flat brush and a round brush. And then for some finer details, a liner brush is really useful. This one is a size 1 liner brush, and I'll have a link down below to the Craft Ammo website where you can be notified of when these brushes are released if you are interested in getting a set. Today I'm using Canson mixed media paper taped down with washi tape. I've got some water here, a towel, and just a flat palette and a spray bottle, so I can use this to mist the gouache to keep it as fresh as possible. So I've laid down on my palette the cool blue, a generous amount of white, and just a bit of burnt umber, and I'll just mist them before I even start. And then picking up my flat brush, I'm just going to pick up some water, and we'll start with the blue sky. We'll transition from blue to white. I am going to try block in about 3/4 of the sky, or maybe 2/3 with blue, and then I'll go in with white and kind of work my way upwards and blend it into the blue. So starting with, you probably want to start with the white and mix that into the blue so you can control how light the color is. And I usually just like to test it a little bit, so that looks pretty good. I'll just make it a little bit darker blue, and I'm just going to bring it down. And it's important that your paint here is nice and creamy, so pick up more paint as you need to. And then let's clean off the brush. And just picking up the fresh white paint, I'm going to start from the bottom, work around the lines I placed in before. And make sure that paint is creamy consistency. And I'll just drag this into the blue and create a 2-color transition like that. And then if you don't want to bring the white too high up, you can just clean off the brush and just brush over that transition part. Then I'm going to let that dry before I paint in the clouds. For the clouds, I'm going to switch to my round brush here. This is my size 8 round brush, and this one here is a synthetic squirrel brush because the hairs are very soft, so it mimics a squirrel brush. So you'll see that when the hairs are wet and you bend them, they tend to stay in their place a little bit more, and this is very good for doing dry brushing and dry brushing clouds and things like that. So when you paint like this with it, it tends to kind of stay a bit more angled, and you can drag it across the paper and get some more textures, and I'll show you that in a second as we use it. So for the clouds, we'll just use some pure white paint, and you'll want to use it in a dry brush texture, so don't mix it with too much water. Keep your brush fairly dry. So I think I actually have a bit too much moisture on mine, so I'm just going to come to a clean place on the palette and squeeze out some more white paint. So when I pick up the paint, I flatten my brush like this, and you can see that the brush sort of maintains its shape a little. So I pick it up like this, and I'm going to drag across the paper like this. So only attempt to do these clouds once the background has completely dried, otherwise your white and blue will mix together, and we want this white to be laid on quite thickly. So you can see I've got this part of the brush covered in the white paint, and I'm just going to drag across. And so because the paint is relatively dry, you'll get this dry brush texture. So I'll just drag across where the clouds are. Some wispy ones here. If you find that the paint isn't spreading enough, you can pick up a little bit of water and go back into the paint. And so when I'm doing this, I'm manipulating the shape of the brush a lot. So this brush comes with a really pointed tip, but because it's like a synthetic squirrel brush, you can manipulate the tip. So for example, at the moment it's very pointed. If I want it to have more of a rounded tip, I can press down like this and it becomes more rounded, and I can use it like this instead of in the very pointed form. So you can manipulate and play around with it to get different shapes, and it's not going to just spring back into the shape that it was in originally. So you can actually fan it out quite a bit like this. Just depends on how you pick up the paint and how you move with it on the paper. So you can see when I go to pick up paint or just using the palette as a surface to kind of change the shape of the brush, I just move it around how I want. So for some really wispy clouds, I wait until there's barely any paint on my brush before going in and painting them on. And so now everything has started to dry. If there's any area where you want to make it a bit more white, you can go in now with some more paint and just add a second layer to make it a bit more opaque. Sometimes for dry brushing textures, I like to use my finger as well, just soften it out a bit more. Okay, so once the clouds are done, I've just cleaned off my round brush, and now we are just going to paint in the water, which is just a reflection. So we'll do that while we still have all this paint on our palette. So I'm going to do the same thing as before. I'll start with the blue and then go in with clean white paint and paint in a transition. So I'll start with the blue at the bottom. So picking up the fresh white, I've got a little bit of blue in it, but that's okay. And I'm just going to start to sweep that in to the blue. And you have a pretty smooth transition done. So we'll leave the water as that is for now. We are going to paint in the mountains here next, these ones first, and then these ones, and then the reflections, and we'll work on the water details in the front last. So now switching back to my round brush, now I'm going to pick up some of this blue again, this cool blue, and you'll see that mountain blue in the background is a bit more green blue or blue green. So we'll mix in some burnt umber, which if you mix burnt umber with a cool blue, it tends to make it a bit more green while also dulling the color a little bit, which is exactly what we need, because colors in the distant are not as saturated as colors in the foreground usually. So we can use a burnt umber to do both things for us, and also just take note of how light or dark the value is. So you can squint at your reference photo and just notice that this blue here of the mountain is lighter in value than everything else in the foreground, and that will just help to convey the distance. So I've just laid down a little bit of warm yellow. I'm going to use that, mix it in. That's going to make it a bit more green. And then the mountain grows a little bit darker into the foreground. So we'll mix up a slightly darker color, but still quite muted. So mix in some burnt umber with that. And in my brush set, I have two round brushes, a size 6 and a size 8. They have different softness of hairs. So the size 8, which is the one I'm using now, is a synthetic squirrel, so it's softer, whereas the size 6 round brush has slightly stiffer bristles. And the difference is the stiffer one is usually a bit easier to control when doing details. So when you're painting something like this, you could actually switch to the size 6 round brush. But I also find that once you get used to the feel of the softer hairs, it gets easier to control as well. So here I'm just continuing to mix my cool blue with my burnt umber. So when I add burnt umber in, it just makes the color a bit darker, a bit more green, and a bit more dull. And then we will move on to painting in the mountain here. We can come in and paint some foliage details a little bit later. So let's move on to here. This part is more of a dull kind of green color. So I've laid down a bit of ultramarine blue here. I'm just going to work into the same area over here and just mix it with burnt umber again. And if you want, you can place in some really small details. Just the tree line kind of bumps up and down. And this brush is great because it has that really pointed tip, so you can do that really easily. Okay, and then for some of the lighter details inside that, just go into a bit of a lighter color here, not too light. Mix a bit of the yellow in there. Okay, and then cleaning that off. Then we can go ahead and block in this entire area. So here I've placed down some black and some cool yellow. So I'm going to mix some of the yellow into the black, so it's not a pure black color, it's a little bit greenish. So because most blacks have a blue undertone to them, if you mix yellow and black, it will become like an olive green color. And I'm just going to use this mixture to block in this entire area. It will act as the base of the shadow color. So I'm going to use the same paint and just paint on the trees that are sticking out. And if it becomes a bit difficult for you to control this with a round brush, feel free to switch to a liner brush for these thinner strokes. And then we can start to layer on the greens on here and go lighter and lighter with each layer. So if we want to make the green lighter, just mix more yellow into the mixture. And I'm going to pick up a bit of the warm yellow too, because the green is quite warm. And so this will be the first layer, and it is the left side of the trees that are facing towards the light. So we will add these highlights on the left side. So just on the left side of the trees, I'm going to start to do these horizontal lines to show that the side is receiving some light. And then for the areas back here, you can do some stippling. So using the same brush, I'm just going to take off some paint around the base of the brush and take off some moisture. And you can see as soon as I started doing that, the bristles started to fan apart. So I'm just going to take off a bit more moisture here. And then if it's not fanned out enough already, just kind of pinch it like this. And this is probably one of my favorite things about this brush, is the ease with which the bristles just split apart by just a bit of pinching here. And so you can start to stipple. But do keep in mind that if you choose to use this brush to do stippling, the point will become blunt over time. But that is why I included 2 round brushes in the set, because I wanted to be able to use one for stippling and not worry about it becoming blunt, and have the other one always have a pointed tip. So that's why in the set there's a size 8 and a size 6 round brush. So I'm just going to stipple in like this. You can see now that that layer has dried. It's dried in a lighter value than before. And so you're going to just want to repeat this by making the paint a bit lighter, and you can even use the same paint on the left side here. And you can just do the same thing, so taking up some moisture and just stippling. Might be a little bit dark, so I am going to quickly mix up some more of that paint, that color we used before, and just go over it. So we've got the blue and burnt umber. We can go in with just a few really subtle highlights, so going into some of the white and the blue and the yellow. So I've just mixed up blue and yellow here. And I just want to use this darker color, just get a bit more of that into the mountain. And I've just placed a little bit of red on the palette. I'm just going to mix that in to the green. And again, we can just highlight on the left side. Stippling on some textures. And now I'm going to pick up some more warm yellow and a touch of red. And with this warmer color, a bit of cool yellow. Touch of white in there. I'm going to go in and place in some of this really nice yellow, just for a little pop of color in there. And then for some lighter areas, I'll go into some white and some cool yellow, and just stipple in a few brighter greens. So now that we've got this top part done, we can paint in the reflection. We use the same color, so this cool blue with some burnt umber to tone it down, and it's a little bit lighter in color, so I'll pick up some white. And I've just placed down some ultramarine blue here, which I'm going to mix in. And then I will reflect this part here, so starting with a dark mixture of black and a bit of yellow. So it's mostly black, just a little bit of yellow. Going to reflect that. Oh, and also in this area you want to reflect some of the green, but we can do that in a second. So same thing as before, just paint in the trees. Once you've got the general shape of everything, you can place in the trees, and everything's a lot more blurry in the reflection, so you don't have to be as precise about it. And for the reflection, we can be a lot more loose as well, so just pick up a bit of yellow, mix that in, and just do what you did before, but just do it upside down. So I've just got some more warm yellow here, and just drop a little bit of that in, hint a little bit at the details in the reflection. Then mixing a little bit of yellow and white for some of those really brighter highlights. For that side I might mix a little bit of yellow into it so it's not pure black because it's quite dark. I don't want it to stand out too much, but I do want it to be quite dark. And then we can paint in the reflection on this side, so you just want to use the same mixture, and with the brush, so I've fanned out the hair so it has a rounded top instead of a pointed top, and I'll just drag down like this, and you can see it just creates these really nice wispy textures. If you want, you can do the same thing here with the trees and the reflection. So the paint is probably dried by now, but I'm just using a brush that's a little bit wet and I'm just reactivating it. So I'm going to do these horizontal strokes to pull out the paint so it looks a bit more streaky, like it's being reflected, like the water movement is making it a bit blurry. Very subtle details, but can help to make it look a bit more convincing. Now we can go ahead and paint in the water ripples. If you've ever followed any of my water tutorials, it's the same gist of things. So we'll start by painting in the darkest color where the water kind of bumps up, and then we'll add in the highlights, and you'll go through an ugly stage where it looks really funny, and then it'll kind of come together. So for the darker color, I'm going to mix black with some of the cool blue. You can mix in some ultramarine blue too if you want. And starting with that, you're just going to find the ripples in the water and just paint on that bump. And then I'm gonna just lighten the color, so instead of having a lot of black, I'll mix in a bit more blue for some of the waves that are a bit further away. They are not quite as dark. And then using this lighter color, you're going to go underneath what you just painted in, and also on top. And I'll go into the very top edge of them, each of them, and just place in this dark line. Once it dries, it'll be a little bit lighter, so don't worry if it looks dark. And now I'll just mimic the pattern I can see in the water, in the reference photo. So the blue needs to be a bit darker than the background color. As I go further into the distance, I'm just going to add more white and lighten the blue. So for the highlight with some fresh white paint, I am just going to place in those highlights I can see. So I'm just going to follow what I see in the reference photo and just go in between each of the waves. There is the highlight. Now you might want to mix it with a little bit of blue so it's not so bright, and then you can add that really bright white accent afterwards. Usually it's around the stage where the water starts to look much more realistic and it's kind of past that ugly stage. And then you can go in with some really pure bright white if you want to, and just go into some of the brightest areas. And using this light color, you can also put more white in there. You can drag across. So I like to dry brush this a little bit so that looks like the movement of water. So dry brushing works pretty well, so try and minimize the amount of water on your brush and in the paint, and just drag it across so there's a streaky texture. And then I want to stipple in some foliage sticking out the side there. So I'm going to go into my black paint with some yellow mixed into it. Then taking off some paint and moisture, just stipple on this. And then picking up some more yellow, mixing it in so it's a bit lighter. I'm just going to stipple on towards the left where there would be a bit more light. And the final thing we need to paint in, I think, is a little pier over here. So we'll use the red for that, and we just want to mix it with a little bit of white and a little bit of warm yellow. And you can definitely switch to a liner brush here, which I think I will, but basically just paint that in. So you need to paint it in as well as its reflection, so you can just paint it a little bit thicker. And I'm just going to quickly switch to my liner brush to make this a little bit easier. So using my size 1 liner brush. And for the part sticking out of it, I'll mix some warm yellow with some white. So picking up some black paint, I'm just going to very carefully paint that right through the middle. This just about wraps up the painting. I really hope you enjoyed painting along with me, and don't forget to check out my Patreon page if you want more tutorials like this one. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in my next video here. Bye bye.